Hello there. Right, we're doing aspects of Star Wars: A New Hope, Woodwind voicings, but not just Woodwind voicings. I'm also including the rest of the orchestra with these ones as well, just because there are two cues which happen to be quite harmonic. And I'm not really looking at melody because it's usually sort of obvious doubling. Flute will double with an oboe or clarinet or whatever. It's just that's more of a choice that's sort of easier to make. With harmony, it's much more challenging because sometimes you have three-note chords, sometimes you have four-note chords, sometimes you have six-note chords. So it's much more of a sort of lesson, I suppose, to us all, orchestration lesson. So I'm looking at 4M2, Obi Wan Kenobi, and 4M5, 5 and 1A, a Home Destroyed, a Hive Villainy. And it's really interesting. So the first bit to point out is that in the sustained notes, which is the C, G, and C, those are played by flute 1 on the top one, flute 2 on the second one, clarinet 1 on the bottom note. So two of the same instrument colour in the first two voices, then a third different instrument colour in the bottom voice. That changes, by the way, later on in other cues, which I've noticed. For some reason, that's all should have been hidden. Never mind. So I'll tidy that up in a minute. But sometimes it's not always the case that that is what's going on. Sometimes it's one of one and then two of the next. So oboe 2, clarinet 1, clarinet 2. So it perhaps depends upon just system. And also it might depend on register as well. We can compare those notes. So in this particular bit, we've got flute 1, flute 2, clarinet, and then the moving pitches, so the ones that go outwards and sort of cascade, and that's a sort of typical feature of a dyad, like that, which is interesting. So notice that the oboe 1, oboe 2, clarinet 2, notice that oboe 1 is also sharing the same pitch as the flute 2. So we do get, actually, interestingly enough, three different colours on that. So there's a certain amount of blend as well, because, of course, oboe 1 is there, and then oboe 2 and clarinet are also there. So actually the only instrument we have on the top, like a lot of these things, when it's blended, is there's one thing at the top and one thing at the bottom, and then there's blends either way. I find that really interesting. So yeah, it's actually really intricate. You know, very easy to play on a piano because, of course, you just put the pedal down. Whoops, we didn't want to highlight that like that. And this is the way that you would do that. So this is, you know, an orchestrated pedal, I suppose, piano pedal. And yeah, it's really interesting. So those notes do cascade downwards, so that by the time we get into the second beat, we've actually got a 6-note chord. And then, and of course, then still two of the same instrument voice, oboe 1, oboe 2, and then the other one is a colour below. And this time, let's also remember that it's both clarinets on the bottom as well, so it gives it a certain amount of homogeneity in the top. The second sort of, let's call it contrapuntal line, it's hardly counterpoint, but it's still a little bit of counterpoint, is where we have a blend of horns. So horn 1, 2, and 3. And then when there's actually just a dyad, Herb generally tends to double the lower pitch, not the upper pitch. So that actually we have our dyad, which is exactly the same, the equivalent of oboe 1, oboe 2, clarinet 2 here, cascading down, because of course it's just an octave below. And then they cascade outwards to 4, 5, 6. So it's quite straightforward. 1, 2, 3, and then 4, 5, 6 are then used when you've got those sort of 6 horns. I wonder whether in, you know, if you had 8 horns, how that would be achieved. And you'd probably just add an extra one to the top and the extra one to the bottom, possibly as well. And then we have a similar feature of, again, it starts on a C and G dyad, with violin 1, violin 2A, and then violin 2B and viola. So that's violin 1 and violin 2A, violin 2B. In other words, A and B are the divisi sections of the violin. and then viola, and then they cascade outwards to a 3-note chord, which is that quartal pitch at that point as well. I've done a whole analysis of what these chords actually are, by the way, much earlier on in elsewhere in my New Hope analysis. But it's a particularly pleasing bit of orchestration. I just remember, first hearing it in the cinema thinking, wow, that's just really lovely. And it's an unusual sort of type of blend because, when Williams does blend, or when Herb Spencer orchestrates it, it's always sort of quite intricate and always very, very well thought out. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that. Cellos and double basses literally just double at the octave as usual. So that is that for that cue, actually. And then the second bit is the whole of something else. So I'm going to try and get this to be a little bit more pretty. So in fact, I think I'm going to just go over the page just so it separates it out a little bit better. So if I can just come in a bit and then go out again. There we go. Yeah. So we've got a whole sort of chunk of music here. So this is, as I said before, 4M5, 5M1A. And it's the bit here which is really intriguing because, of course, it's both strings and wind and brass, and you can see how they all sort of fit together. So the way this works is that the bassoons are doubling. So I'm concentrating mainly on wind, but so the way the bassoons work is bassoon 1 is copying the oboe. Bassoon 1 is copying the viola. Bassoon 2 is the second bit of the viola, and then the contra at this point is doing the cello at unison, by the way. So it's not an octave below, it's at unison. So it's actually quite high for the contra in the stave. Then we have this melodic line, which is played by the alto flute and the cor anglais. That sort of typical 0-1-3-4 type sort of thing that we've got. So that's intriguing. And then we've got here violin 1 and then the 2 divisi violin 2s, violin 1, violin 2 here, which are doing different material as well. So the harmony is really interesting as well. So it's just full of interest, just lots going on, basically. As I said before, if you want to have a look at the actual bit of information, I have done that as well. I'm just seeing whether there's a quick way of doing it whilst I'm here. I'm not sure there is, but I'm going to try getting to it. So where are we? New Hope. You can't see what I'm doing at the moment, can you? Sib reduction, and this one is that one. So 4 and 5. Let's have a look, because I will have done all of this before. Yeah, so F sharp half dim 7, F minor with a major 7th, and then with a major 9th, and then a flat 6, basically. I call it flat 13 just because it kind of extends that way, sort of jazz-wise. So I'll keep that there for the time being. But basically, I'm trying not to clutter it too much because I'm just dealing with orchestration stuff here. But there's a real clarity about it. The reason that is not doubled anywhere is because it doesn't really... You don't really want it doubled anywhere in the strings. Otherwise it loses its particular identity. So again, completely different from a Howard Shaw approach, where everything would be unison doubled with whatever instruments happen to be there. So that would probably have viola in it, or even sort of one desk of cellos, for example, or even bassoon possibly as well. So then we have a very, very high wire on the strings here with just C's, which I think is both violins actually at that point. I can't quite remember, but there we go. In fact, I do have it here. somewhere. I just need to go back. So no, actually it's just violin 1 at that point. And then sort of quite basic stacking. Flute 1, flute 2, alto, flute. Yeah. Of course, flute 3 would quite struggle with those low notes, especially an octave above the trombones as well. But you can see how they all fit in. It's just literal stacking. And then bassoon 2 is there with the cello and the contra with the double bass, now in a sort of more obvious register. The harp just iterates those notes and then stops. It just comes out after that as well. So there's a definite sort of blend of colours in this particular thing, and that's why I've called it blends with other colours, because that's what it was. But also we got, you know, just basic stacking. So if in doubt, if you've got sort of 3 of the same things, you can just stack. So we move on to bar 17, and this is much, much more intricate. So if I go to bar 17 here, it's this bit, which you'll all recognise. There. Completely lost in note performer. I'm not quite sure why. I think I have reset it, but it just doesn't come out adequately, really. This bit here. It just sounds really squeezed. Yeah, I mean, obviously it'd be a lot louder, but basically it's that little bit of stuff that we get with the Force theme. Here I'm just concentrating on the woodwind because, of course, you can see that, you know, in terms of doubling, we've got a little bit of this in the cello. So that is with the harp, or the harps, and then that's all, you know, obviously the lower sounding bit of the wind. So if I just choose those, and then the cello takes on a bass role, along with the contrabassoon, by the way, as well. So that often happens. So interesting that the contra tends to double not just the double bass, but also the cello at that point as well, in terms of octave doubling, and indeed with the timp as well, just because it's a sustained note. However, let's have a look at this in more detail. So we've got oboe 1, clarinet 1, and oboe 2 at the top, then bass clarinet and bassoon 1 at the bottom. When it then divides into the next note, so when it goes to that dyad, we've still got oboe 1 and clarinet 1 at the top. Then we've got oboe 2 and clarinet 2 there, so it's a stacking thing, but also blended. Then we have bassoon 1 and bass clarinet below the bassoon. And then when it goes into another 4 notes, those swap. So the bass clarinet is actually in voice 3, like that, whereas the bassoon just does that. So there's a nice little bit of sort of melodic interchange or cross voicing at that point, which I think is really interesting. Then it goes into 6 notes. So we then have oboe 1, clarinet 1. Let's just rectify some of that. At the top, clarinet 2, then oboe 2, then bass clarinet. So there is a interlocking, but with a blend at the top. So oboe, clarinet, in other words, that interlocking feature. But the oboe and the clarinet 1 share the same top note. And then bassoon 1 and 2, bassoon 2 basically joins in at that point. So when we go back into 4 notes, the flutes join as well with the oboe and the clarinet 1. So the oboe and the clarinet 1 were always at the top, and they continue, but now the flutes have arrived. Then the second pitch down, because it's sort of 3 pitches actually, isn't it, not 4, is oboe 2, clarinet 2, and then bass clarinet, bassoon 1 and 2. So it's all sort of registrally obvious. And then another bit of stacking, flutes, oboes, another little bit of oboe and clarinet, then clarinet. So there's a certain amount of blend, bass clarinet, bassoon 1 and 2. That stays exactly the same with the flute 3 joining the top voice, which is why I've sort of doubled it. So they always stay in the same position. that's when the horns join, and basically, sorry, they just join the 2 bottom notes and then go into 3 notes. So again, it just is exactly the same as it was before. And then this one is slightly different. So when we have a sort of triple, version of a chord, so it's just a B flat minor chord. So we've got, so that's flute 1 and then 2 and then flute 3, oboe 1. Normally it'd just be 1, 2, 3 these days. I don't know why they sort of interlock them. That is quite a sort of old school method. But basically flutes, then 1 of the same instrument. So completely different from what we had here, which is much lower, by the way. So this one is all the way up into that F6 territory, D flat 6 and B flat 5. And then the middle register, so on the stave, we've also got the same thing going on. We've got 1 instrument of 1 colour and then 2 of the same on the lower voices. So voice 2, voice 3 is clarinets, but voice 1 in this context is oboe 2. Then we have more of a stacking system as well. Bass clarinet, bassoon 1, bassoon 2. So literally it goes, no, flute 1 and 2, but then flute 3, oboe 1, oboe 2, so clarinet 1, clarinet 2. They're all stacked, but notice how the flute 1 and 2 this time are on the outer voices. So unlike what I'd said before, where it's usually just 1 instrument on the outer voice, this time there are 2 instruments on the outer voice. So, it can change, basically, is the advice. And then the horns also join in bass clarinet, bassoons as well. So there is a certain amount of blend at that point, with 1 instrument at the top, so bass clarinet, and then 2 different ones, but basically of the same family below it. So a really intriguing little passage. I'm going to play it for you again. And then that's just the usual doubling here. Basically oboe and clarinet play the same thing. Oboe 2, clarinet 2 play the same thing. Then we've got the octave below on bass clarinet, and then horns also blend with that as well. So the usual thing that we already had before carries on. Bass clarinet is horn 4, bassoon 1 is horn 5, bassoon 2 is horn 6. And then we move on to much further on bar 63. So in this particular bit, it's this section. Just brilliant. It's so jazz. It's just incredible. But this could have been out of Phantom Menace, couldn't it? It's all of that sort of augmented, what I call sort of, Newt Gunray harmony, basically. Sort of Trade Federation augmented chords. So that one is a little bit more straightforward. So here, just flute 1, 2, 3, which is stacked. And now it's back to this type of version. 1 instrument at the top of 1 colour, oboe 1, that one, and then 2 clarinets on that. So stacked and blended, basically. Horns are stacked an octave below, by the way. And then moving on to bar 79, I think it's quite useful not just to show the score, but actually just run through it, I think. Yeah, it's just that bit. I love that whole sort of section. I think it's just rather exotic sounding. And it's really intriguing. So I'm just going to play it one more time. So it's this little bit here with, I think I'd like that to be there. Let's just add that little harp. Often the harp, by the way, doubles that articulation of a horn entry or trumpet entry or some other entry. There we go. And then those sort of triads coming in later as well, which are sort of obvious. But we'll deal with this bit here. So flutes 1, 2, and 3 play the melody, but then they cascade downwards. So in this case, again, a sort of weird interlocking. So flute 1, 3, 2, but nowadays it'd just be 1, 2, 3. There's no sense in anything else otherwise. So, of course, some of them have slightly awkward leaps. So the C sharp to the F sharp, that's okay, and that's easy. So here, then, again, the same idea, oboe 1, one instrument of the top voice, and then 2 of the same different instruments, clarinet 1 and clarinet 2 in the bottom. So an interesting array. And I have seen that, often it's just flute 1, 2, 3. Of course, it's slightly different when you've got more notes. In this case, it's flute 1 and 2, then 3, then oboe, and it's very much blended, that one. This is a bit less blended because of the top 3 voices all being flutes. And so then moving on to bar 101, which is here, is this lovely bit here. Yeah. So quite Raiders of the Lost Ark type sort of sound. Yeah, with the flutes joining as well. So this one, a little bit of enclosure, which I think is interesting. You'll notice that the oboe 1 and oboe 2 enclose, the clarinets, but clarinet 1 is also doing the top voice as well. So it's a certain amount of blend and enclosure. So let's call it blended enclosure. So oboe 1 and clarinet 1 at the top, clarinet 2, and then oboe 2, enclosing the clarinets. And I have seen that a lot in Williams's music, and it's all middle of the star, so that could be a nice sort of default type of thing, because it goes all the way from the bottom space of the stave to the top space of the stave. So it's quite a nice little default. Then when the flutes join in, it's actually slightly different, because we now have an out of order bit where we have flute 1, clarinet 1, flute 2, clarinet 2, but then oboe in the bottom. And I think that's just to vary the orchestration at that point. Let's just listen to it without anything else. Yeah, really interesting. Because normally you would think that the oboe should take the tune at that point and play the Fs. But they don't. It actually plays the lowest sounding note, which I think is really intriguing. So we've got flutes, obviously all the way through, but, clarinet 1, clarinet 2, and oboe at that point as well. And I think it's just, a way of contrasting this slightly and subtly. And it's sort of almost like a Viennese orchestration in some ways. By which I mean the first Viennese school, the sort of Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven type sort of stuff. And it's really intriguing. I love things like that. It could also be to the do with, the fact they're all sort of root position chords as well, and you want something strong on the root and perhaps less so in the middle. So that's why you have a slightly more nasal sounding root note. That could also be a thing as well. And the same here, that they have a nasal root note with the oboe and the clarinets up at the top as well. So an interesting one. That is more out of order because there's no oboe 1 at the top. There's no oboe 2 here. That's the oboe 1 taking over. So that's why I've called it out of order there as opposed to here, because we actually have the oboe blended at that point as well. So I just thought that was a useful little exercise just to sort of see what wind are doing in that particular cue. And I hope it gives you sort of lots of good ideas about how, if that was just a piano, how would you arrange it for wind? And I think now we kind of know. So, either we can have one of the same and then two, one timbre and then 2 different timbres but of the same family, if you see what I mean. So oboe, 2 clarinets, or 2 oboes, 1 clarinet, that sort of thing. And you can sort of chop and change a little bit, perhaps. And I think also that is really, again, quite useful for when you need to arrange different notes of the chords. If there's just one pitch and then 2 pitches, 4 but sort of doesn't really do anything, then a harmonic bit, and then doing the same thing. Like that. And I just think it's a really useful little device to have up your sleeve. And these are all sort of things, devices. This is what I would call a device. So that is it for now, and I really hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope it's useful. I know lots of my patrons find these incredibly useful, so I'll continue doing these, and they don't take quite as much time as doing the other stuff that I do. So I will endeavour to do more, and I think I quite like the blended approach when you can sort of see it all in with other instruments as well. Sometimes it's not appropriate because I think it's sort of obvious what's going on, and especially if it's sort of rather differentiated orchestration, by which I mean nobody else is playing that apart from, let's say, piano, but nobody else is doing that. So I will do more, and let me know in the comments what you think, and I will be back, and see you soon.